So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to biological scientist Chris Kirby. He's here to talk to us about and show us about the importance of the eastern oyster. Okay, sending it over to you, Chris.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to School Daze 2020. My name is Chris Kirby. I'm one of the many biological scientists here at Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I work with a number of other many talented scientists, and unfortunately they couldn't join me today, so I'd like to initially start off by thanking them for all their hard work. They're really a great team, and I do enjoy working with them. So anyway, to go on about myself, how did I even get here? Well, I grew up in the state of Maryland, and even when I was small, I loved chasing all sorts of different critters, bugs, wildlife, going hiking, just being in the woods. It was really kind of my thing. From there, I grew up also in close proximity to the Chesapeake Bay. And for those of you who are or not familiar with it, the Chesapeake Bay is well known for its populations of oysters. So as I grew up, the plight of those oysters started to become pretty apparent. And when I started going to college at the University of Maryland in College Park, I even met up with a number of other students who were involved with groups studying those oysters for various problems that are facing them in the bay. So what we do here at Florida Fish and Wildlife, well, we monitor the eastern oyster, Cresostria virginica. We also do monitoring for bay scallops and marine gastropod snails. But today I'm going to primarily focus on the oyster. So we monitor their overall health. We look for disease prevalence. We monitor juvenile recruitment, or what's also better known as SPAT, which is basically a baby oyster. We also do overall population surveys. So we'll go out a couple times a year and look at the overall number of reefs. Of course, we'll only do a small sample in various spots of the reef. We can't count thousands and thousands of oysters to get a full assessment, but we figured a way that we can kind of guesstimate the number of oysters based on just counting these small sections. So why does this matter? Why do we care about oysters? Well, they're extremely important. They're what's known as a keystone species, which I'll revisit that definition when I'm done with my first part of the presentation. They're also an ecosystem engineer, which the definition of that is basically exactly what it sounds. It is something that builds an ecosystem. So for example, trees in a forest, you have all sorts of different types of forests. Well, those specific species of trees that make different forests, those are the ecosystem engineer for that forest. Coral reefs, for example, they're a great one. Corals are the ecosystem engineer of the coral reefs. And oysters, you guessed it, they're the ecosystem engineer of an oyster reef. So I use the term reef, and a lot of times people primarily, when you hear the word reef, the immediate idea is a coral reef. It's beautiful, it's pristine, tons of tropical fish, warm water, lots of bright colors. Well, an oyster reef isn't quite that. We still have tons of species on it, but maybe it's not quite as pretty, and a lot of like shades of gray and brown. And oftentimes the water isn't always very warm. Oysters actually live as far north as areas in Canada where the water can be extremely cold year round, which that's not my cup of tea. That's kind of why I'm doing work here in Florida, where we only have to put up with that cold water a couple months out of the year. Another reason oysters are important, other than them being a keystone species and ecosystem engineer, is that they clean water. Now, I don't know if anyone's heard, oysters are put up on this pedestal way up there where there's an individual, a healthy adult oyster is said to be able to filter up to 50 gallons of water in a day. That's a little extreme. That's given pristine conditions, everything's perfect, the oysters are super happy. Typically, we're only going to see them probably 5 to 15 gallons a day. But still, when you compound that to a reef of thousands and thousands of oysters, that's still a pretty big deal. So what that's going to turn me to now is I have an interactive map here. We're going to demonstrate, first of all, an estuary. So for those of you who don't know what an estuary is a dynamic ecosystem. And what that means is that it is constantly changing. The tides flow in and the tides flow out. So I kind of can simulate this with the brown water being the river is 0 parts per thousand salinity. That's pure fresh water. And then over here we have the ocean at 35 parts per thousand salinity, which is an average ocean salinity kind of throughout the world. So as the day goes on, we'll see these tides go in and out. And up here, I have different salinity gauges. So given standard conditions, oysters upriver are going to be about 10 to 15 parts per thousand. Mid-river, maybe 15 to 20. And then close to the river mouth, this reef is anywhere between 20 to 30 parts per thousand at any given time. That's under perfectly normal natural conditions, and we have 3 happy, healthy oyster reefs. What's going to happen over time, though, is different things are going to alter this environment to cause shifts in these salinities that will impact these oyster reefs, sometimes permanently. So what we'll start out with is, given a natural system, Florida, we have a rainy season. So we have hurricanes. Well, we're going to have a hurricane go by the river, and it's going to sit up here and dump a ton of rain on the river. So what's going to happen as the hurricane does that is we're going to notice all this water flow out. We're going to have pretty fresh water. And this might go on for a little while, but the benefit of this system right now is that a hurricane, a lot of the water gets soaked into the soil. So only some of it ends up in the river. So we'll see these salinities drop for a little bit. That's okay. Oysters can survive adverse conditions by closing their shells completely for usually about a week or 2. If things persist past that, then the oysters are in trouble. But this is just one single natural event. What's going to happen then is eventually the water's going to recede, and it's going to go back up. And we're going to kind of be back where we were with these ones at 10 to 15, 20 to 25, and around 30 parts per thousand salinity. Oysters are typically happy. I've read different things. Let's say it's an average of about 10 to 20 parts per salinity, even though as the tide's going in and out, they'll know when to open and close to take advantage of the best water for them. And while they're doing this filtering, they're known to take all sorts of different things out of that water, just all sorts of particulate matter, so they're helping clear the water. Oysters have been found potentially to even take in microplastics. So they're very beneficial to the environment as a whole. So over time, we're going to have, humans are going to move in. We have a small town here, and it's going to set up on the river. Most human civilizations throughout time have always set up on rivers near water. Water is, of course, as you know, very important to the success of human life. So what they're going to bring is we're going to have someone, he's going to really want to fish for oysters. He's got his oyster rake and his boat, and he's going to set up on this reef right here. And he's going to sit there and he's going to fish oysters. And maybe over time, this is done in a somewhat sustainable manner. They don't harvest too many. But let's say this city then becomes successful because of this. So then your little town develops into a big old city. And now we have a big old city on the river. I'm sure many of you know many big cities that are on rivers. Well, guess what? They started somewhere. They started as little developments and over time grew into these massive cities that we see today. However, what this brings with it is a whole different set of problems. The city is now going to need higher demand for the water. So they're going to install a dam to start controlling that water flow. And then what this is going to do is, for those of you who aren't aware or are, Florida has a dry season and a rainy season, or more commonly known as the hurricane season. So let's say we start off, we have a dry season and we start to lose a lot of our river water. And it goes all the way up and the city starts hogging that water. It needs it for crops. It needs it for livestock, and it needs it for its own people to drink that water. So this is going to stay in a very saline environment. We're going to see across the board salinities get pretty high. So what that's going to do initially is this reef isn't going to like that. This reef closes to the ocean and is at very high salinities now. It's going to start feeling pretty rough. Some of the oysters are going to start getting ill. So what also likes high salinities that we found is parasites and disease. So what I have here is we have a pea crab, which is a small parasite that lives on the inside of an oyster on its gills and steals food and nutrients from it. And then represented below that is a small disease called dermo, which can infect oyster tissue and kill it eventually over time. So this oyster reef is going to start getting infected with that. Another thing we've seen that prefers high salinity is this guy right here, the Atlantic oyster drill. What they do is a type of marine gastropod snail that loves to eat oysters. They have a radula that they use in their mouth to scrape a hole directly through an oyster shell. And then they'll put their mouth in that hole and eat the oyster as it's trying to seek protection in its shell, but it has no way to defend itself at this point from the snail. So over time, 3, 4, 5 months go by, no rain, no rain, no rain. Salinities just keep creeping up, keep creeping up. These oysters are basically living in the ocean, and they're infested with parasites and diseases and predators. Well, guess what's going to happen to this reef? We're going to lose this reef completely. We're going to say we've lost about 25% of this historic reef. Although I'm not really giving any time frame for this, this can happen at any rate of time. So what will happen is, let's say we finally get some relief. Here comes another hurricane. And this hurricane is going to at least offer some relief to this entire system. But as I mentioned earlier, the soil sucks up some of that water. Well, now we've got the city here. The soil's been paved over. All that water's got to go somewhere. All that water's going to go in the river. And then this river, on top of getting the hurricane and the natural flow we saw earlier, well, now they're dumping even more water in there. And if we have a particularly busy rainy season, they're going to have to open that floodgate. And then we're just going to see it all come rushing out. And this is basically now the river. It's just this, the salinities, we're going to see them drop drastically. And if this does not end, as we start to get closer to the rainy season, we get more and more hurricanes, more and more heavy rains, salinities are going to drop even lower. And this reef, I forgot to do this. This reef's dead. And this reef ends up at 0. And it can't live for more than a couple weeks at 0. So this reef, that reef also dies. We're going to lose this reef completely. So now, let's say we're down to about 50% historic oyster reef. And then this person that's out here still fishing, well, we don't have much oysters left. So we're going to have to close that season. Sorry, buddy. No way of life for that fisher person. They have to move away. And then this one reef that's left, well, it's not happy anymore either under these now completely altered environmental conditions. So this reef is just going to continue to be sad, and we're stuck with this reef is probably not even going to be the same size it was. We're going to have a little tiny reef left. So we maybe have, I don't know at this point, 30% of historic oyster reef. And also another thing that's happened too is towards the end of this rainy season, if it hasn't stopped, well, we have bay scallops that live out here in the pure saltwater. And now they're getting too much fresh water. So guess what? Not only have we lost oysters, but scallops closest to shore, what's going to happen to them? They're all gone too. So now you have to take your boat out even further when you want to go scalloping to try and find scallops. So that's going to kind of conclude this part of the demonstration. What I'm going to go ahead and go on to from here is I'm going to talk about what we can do to help understand the keystone species concept. So I mentioned that earlier. What is a keystone species? A keystone species is one that everything relies on it so vitally in the environment that without it, the environment wouldn't even exist. So not only do we have oysters in an ecosystem engineer that build their own habitat, but so many other species rely on them that we could lose other species if they're gone. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the camera real quick, and we're just going to scoot on over. To this archway. So this really visualizes the keystone species concept. We have all sorts of different species in this archway represented that rely on oyster reef. We have otters, we have cownose rays, sheep's head, stone crab, American oyster catcher, redfish, mussels, toadfish, blue crabs, all sorts of different species of worms, bull sharks that are well known to go in freshwater habitats. And yes, we have seen some small ones in our oyster reefs. And snook. We see a lot of these species when we're out there working in the field. Well, what do you think is going to happen? The oyster here, that's the keystone of this archway, if I go ahead and pop that out. Well, let's take a look. Entire ecosystem collapse. All of those species are now gone. We've lost everything. So maybe some of them, like let's say this snook. Maybe this snook here, maybe he found some mangroves or something. Maybe this sheep's head found some mussels somewhere under a dock. But we're still going to lose a larger number of those animals because now a whole ecosystem they had to live in is completely wiped out. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera back so we're not staring at that horrible devastation. And to go ahead and talk more about how we can save this from happening, to prevent the total collapse of that ecosystem. Well, one thing, if you like to eat oysters, I recommend you get sustainably harvested oysters. Be sure that they're farmed or caught in a sustainable manner so that we're not losing all these reefs due to overfishing. And then when you do consume them, be sure that the shell is recycled. Many restaurants do offer shell recycling programs, and if they don't, take the shell with you and see if you can find somewhere that does. There are many places that will take oyster shell. We even will use oyster shell for some of our projects if the shell is functional enough and not too damaged. Because oyster's fat, which I mentioned earlier, baby oysters, they like to settle on that shell. So we'll leave little strings of shell out in the environment for those to settle on, and that's how we monitor the babies on a monthly basis. Another thing too with oyster shells is sometimes when I go hiking, I mentioned I still like to go hiking. I did it when I was a kid, I still love it now. I'll be around campsites, and I will see oyster shells just scattered on the ground. And first of all, I wouldn't want to eat oysters while camping. I prefer to eat them in a safer, more clean setting. But I will collect up those oyster shells because oyster shells don't belong in a forest. They're not contributing anything in a forest. So I will take those and I will then process them, and we can use them to either throw them back out and establish more reef, or use them for our projects to help monitor juvenile recruitment. And then lastly, another really important thing you can do is conserve water. Like I mentioned, the city that was using up all the water and not letting any flow out. If you use less of that water, more of that water can go back into the estuarine system and benefit everything that lives there. So unfortunately, because situations have become dire across the planet, many areas have seen anywhere from 85 to 99% loss of their oyster reefs. So if we can at least try our best to help them, maybe we can even see some of it recover. You can even join local volunteer groups that are involved with various projects, such as setting out oyster domes that oysters can settle on, setting out bags of oyster shell for the spats to settle on. And some of you even offer, if you have a private dock, you can hang oyster shells on a string to help make oyster clusters that can then at some point be placed in the environment, and they'll also continue to filter the water. So I guess for now, that concludes everything I had to say about the eastern oyster. So I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to if you all have any questions. If you didn't want to stay for questions, I would once again like to thank you all for tuning into today's event. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Chris. And yes, we do have questions. We're ready to share those questions. First wanted to know, let's see here, how many different kinds of oysters are there?
Ooh, that's a great question. I actually do not know. There's many different species. There are even animals that are called oysters that may not necessarily be oysters. So it's kind of a gray area in that sense. But that's a great question. I'm sorry I don't know the answer to it. But primarily here in Florida, the eastern oyster is the one that we really know of as the oyster. There's another called a tree oyster that's not even in the same genus, though. So then we're talking if they're even within the same genus, Chrysostrea.
With oyster reefs being impacted the way they are there any concerns about the snail that is it considered invasive? Are we trying to remove that snail from the environment?
So that's a great question. When we talk about invasive species, we're typically talking about an alien species that has been introduced to an environment that's not desired there. The Atlantic oyster drill and other species of oyster drill typically are actually naturally occurring. And if the environment is in proper homeostasis, the number of those drills, they belong there. They're part of that ecosystem. They should be there because then what they serve is a purpose of they eat the oysters, but then something else eats the oyster drill. There are plenty of other fish species, such as sheep's head and hogfish, that love to eat marine gastropods. So unless the numbers of them are really ridiculously high, it's not something we should be concerned with trying to kill or remove from the environment.
Okay, great. You mentioned the plastics, or microplastics. Do you ever find plastic in oysters?
We actually did start a pilot study with this, but we didn't have a lot of success with it because a lot of times microplastics can be so small that they're difficult to detect, and we didn't really have the equipment to help keep other plastics from contaminating our samples. But I have on many occasions, even when I mentioned the shells of oysters, the strings of those that we have to monitor recruitment of juveniles, I found various pieces of trash, fishing line, little bits of plastic. Even one time I had a barnacle on that shell that had a piece of plastic in it. And I used my tweezers to pull this piece of plastic. The barnacles, the only thing that was left was the shell of the barnacle because the piece of plastic had crowded out the space the barnacle was trying to live in, and the barnacle itself had died. Now, I know we're not concerned about barnacles. A lot of people consider them pests for encrusting things. But yes, the microplastic killed it. So it is definitely something that maybe given more resources, we could look at more in the future.
Are oysters difficult to find?
No, not really. But it is funny you asked that question. Given the right conditions, they are not. Oysters can settle on all sorts of surfaces. They'll settle on seawalls. They'll settle on glass bottles. They'll settle on sticks, even though that's not really primary for them. A lot of times, spat will settle on things that they may not be able to survive and reach adulthood on. But You can find them anywhere. In areas that have suffered massive losses of oysters, you could go out, and where there was historically many oysters, you could struggle all day. When we see die-offs, like when I mentioned in our example, every month we collect 5 live oysters from many different areas. Totally, we look at over 100 oysters a month, analyzing them for diseases and pests and things. We'll have areas sometimes where we were easily able to collect those, it may become very difficult, or we're just sitting there looking at empty, dead oyster shells if something has caused the entire reef to die. Sometimes the reefs can recover from this activity, but as I showed in my demonstration, sometimes they don't. And we just eventually have to give up on that site completely, and we just can no longer get data for that.
Can you tell us, talk a little bit more about how oysters filter the water and what happens to the things that they filter out, like plastics?
So oysters, what they typically do is they open their shells just a margin when they're in the water, and if they sense conditions are well, they'll just siphon in the water slowly, and it goes across their gills, and they'll filter out food particles and things like that. So they're taking all that, and it just, even the microplastic will go into the oyster stomach, because oysters do have organs like humans to some minor degree, nowhere near as complex as humans, but so that's actually what we're looking for when we're looking for microplastic in oysters. They can end up in their gut. So all that different stuff will end up there, and then typically they won't release the microplastics. They'll just spit out clean water.
Do you dive for oysters?
You can dive for oysters. It's rare that we've actually done proper scuba diving. We've had some reefs that are deep enough, and I know we have a crew that works up in the Panhandle, Apalachicola, East Point area. They do most of their diving for oysters because it's hard for them to find them, and it's typically easier for them to just jump in the water on scuba and try and look around as best they can in the really murky water up there to see if they can find any oysters for their sampling efforts. But for the most part, we're usually in areas that are just waist deep where we work.
Once an oyster reef has collapsed, if the reef area were in good, ideal conditions, how long would it take for that reef to rebuild?
That's a good question. So what we could see, usually within just a few months, if conditions return to normal, we'll already start to see spat settlement. And it only takes oysters 3 to 4 more months to reach a somewhat mature size, maybe around like 30 to 40 millimeters in shell length. Within a year, we'll at least see decent recovery. Usually things like spat spawning, oysters spawn with the seasons like many other organisms do. So it also depends on what time of the year these die-offs may have occurred that we may see sooner or later recovery.
Okay. Are all oysters safe to eat?
That is a great question. And the answer to that is no. Well, not all oysters are safe to eat. You want to be sure when you're getting oysters, don't get them off some guy just with a cart on the side of the street trying to peddle you oysters. As far as you know, he took oysters off the seawall right near the sewage drain. And believe me, whatever came out of that sewage drain, that oyster is eating. And then if you eat that oyster, you're eating it. So definitely be sure you're getting safe oysters from safe areas.
What do you like most about your job?
What I like most about my job is being in the field. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up just loving the outdoors. The field work is really kind of the highlight. We spend time driving around in boats and in cars a lot, and some of the areas we go to can be kind of remote. So I do get to see at least a fair amount of other wildlife while we're working with oysters. And one of our common phrases someone brought to our lab once with any sort of animals is poke it for science or poke it for fun. So we'll see all sorts of crazy stuff come up. One time we had a trap in the Lake Worth estuary. We pulled it up, there's lionfish in it. Another one of our oyster cages I pulled up, there's a big old sheep's head in it.
Wow.
Various crabs and all sorts of other stuff. I just can't help but love playing with animals at times. Of course, I always try my best to make sure we release them unharmed.
How long have you been studying or working in the mollusk group or studying oysters?
I have been with Florida Fish and Wildlife for a little over 8 years now. So if that gives you some idea, I haven't packed up ship and left yet. So.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for teaching us about the eastern oyster and how vital and important learning that it's a keystone species to our ecosystem.
All right, and thank you, and thank everybody who joined today.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.